Dutch van der Linde is by far the most important and intriguing character in the Red Dead Redemption series. It's hard to say much about Dutch that hasn't already been said, because there are a lot of video essays on YouTube breaking down his character and story, or even just certain aspects of it, and they're absolutely worth checking out if you haven't already. In fact, Dutch seems to dominate the discussion when it comes to videos on any Red Dead Redemption subject. And it's not just YouTube either. There's countless articles, Reddit threads, wiki entries, comment sections, and so on, all giving their 2 cents on Dutch's character. And a lot of these opinions can vary wildly from post to post. And all this made me think of an old Neil deGrasse Tyson video I saw recently, which I acknowledge is a weird inclusion in a Red Dead video, but just bear with me because I think it's an interesting point.
If you go to the bookstore and look for books on gravity, there's maybe 4 or 5 on the shelf. Look for books on stars, there's maybe 6. Look for books on consciousness, there's shelf after shelf after shelf after shelf. That means we know nothing about it, okay? Because once you know, it's done, no more books are necessary, and you move on to the next problem. Don't be confused by the volume of what is written.
Now, I'm not saying we don't know anything at all about Dutch, but I think the amount of discussion around him does sort of indicate a lack of complete understanding or consensus about him. And that is an intentional choice by Rockstar. He is, by his nature, a deliberately ambiguous character. The conversation usually revolves around whether or not his behaviour in the later chapters is indicative of his true character. As in, did he go crazy, or was he always that way? And I'm not even really sure that's the most interesting question for me. People describe him as this monstrous psychopathic narcissist who only cares about himself and feigns giving a shit about the people he supposedly loves and cares about, as if his whole nice guy act is just a big show to manipulate the gang into following him. And I think that's a mischaracterization. And how much less interesting of a character does it make him? Imagine for a moment that he does care deeply about the game. Imagine that most of what he says are things he truly believes in. And imagine that he does love Arthur and John as his own sons. So how much more intriguing is it that he would betray them anyway? That he would abandon everything he stands for and betray his own family? That is the better question for me. Why does he do that? And in replaying the game again to try to get to the bottom of that question, I found myself feeling something I didn't quite expect to. I felt sorry for Dutch van der Linde. I acknowledge that this is an overused quote, but Dutch van der Linde is one of the most appropriate characters to associate it with, I think. Because a lot of his external persona is quite appealing and heroic, at least as far as notorious outlaws go. He's tall, handsome, well-dressed, clean, but he also treats the gang with tremendous kindness and respect, and genuinely seems to care about their well-being and mourns their losses.
I loved Davy, Jenny, Sean, Mac. They may be okay. We don't know. But we lost some folks. Now, if I could throw myself in the ground in their stead, I'd do it gladly. But we're gonna ride out and we're gonna find some food. Everybody, we're safe now. We've been through worse than this before. Now all of you, get yourselves warm. Stay strong. Stay with me. We ain't done yet.
This scene also highlights another key aspect of Dutch. By far the most impressive part of Benjamin Byron Davis's performance is the incredible range he gives to Dutch's voice. The way in which he can project his voice to be commanding and inspiring, or darken it to be threatening, or soften it to be warm and gentle without it ever feeling jarring or inconsistent, adds so much to how textured Dutch feels as a character. And it makes him so convincing and magnetic as an extremely skilled public and persuasive speaker that even for the player, is strangely irresistible. Another clever way in which Rockstar makes Dutch appealing at the start of the game is through the very first group of antagonists we encounter in Chapter 1. Colin and the O'Driscolls are a great juxtaposition to Dutch and his gang, as our first encounter with them sees them having murdered Sadie Adler's husband and held her hostage in her own home. And we see immediately just how differently Dutch handles the same situation.
Wild thing, ain't ya?
Leave her alone!
I wasn't doing nothing. She's one of them O'Driscolls.
No, she ain't, Michael. Look at her. Miss, are you...
Oh, you fool! Michael!
Miss, now, it is gonna be okay. We mean you no harm. Miss, come on. It'll be okay. We need to get out of here, and quick. You okay, miss?
They came 3 days ago. And my husband,
Miss, you are safe now. And you can't stay here. You come with us.
On the other hand, the first time we see Colin, he hits and humiliates one of his own men and commands a much larger force of outlaws that he apparently doesn't even know the names of, nor does he command much loyalty amongst his ranks. Whereas Dutch's gang would die for him.
I don't want to kill all these folk, Dutch. Just you.
In that case, it'd be my honor to join you. Excuse me, friends. I have an appointment to keep with...
Say what you like about Dutch, but from long-timers like Arthur and John to newer members like Charles, everyone loves and reveres Dutch van der Linde. To them, he's a kind, generous man with high moral values. And we can see this clearly in the way that he conducts his business. Aside from how we saw him interact with Sadie, we also know that in his earlier years he would share his stolen riches with the poor like some sort of Robin Hood, and generally condemns senseless violence, or preying on those he considers as innocent. Most of his gang consists of people who are at one point or another on the fringes of society. I'm talking about orphans, immigrants, prostitutes, people of colour, etc. And while yes, these types of people are obviously the kind of low-hanging fruit that would easily be recruited into the gang, I don't think that's necessarily evidence that his generosity towards them is fake. As I said up top, I've seen others describe Dutch's apparent nobility and kindness as a sham or a facade. I even called it that in my previous video. But in hindsight, I actually don't think it's quite accurate to describe him that way. For one, Dutch has been acting this way for the better part of 2 decades, which is obviously why his followers display such devoted loyalty and believe in him so completely.
You don't even possess your own men. $1,000 to the man who kills him and sets me free.
Loyalty like that doesn't just happen overnight, and it's not motivated by fear like it might be with Colin. It's motivated by a genuine faith in Dutch that he has rightly earned from them. I think if Dutch was a cold-blooded narcissist that didn't care about his gang, I think the walls around his persona would have come crashing down a lot sooner than 20 years in. And I would say most of his behaviour up until the end of the gang is consistent with his reputation and his rhetoric. Speaking of which, that rhetoric, that cause he's supposedly fighting for, is a pretty important piece of the puzzle. Dutch is an anarchist. He believes America was meant to be a country without laws or taxes, where society can organise itself on a voluntary basis. Meaning you shouldn't have to participate in society if you don't want to, and there's no government around to force you to. What this means in practice is that he sees a group like the Pinkertons, or even the US government, as an oppressive force that is standing in the way of his dream for a free America, and that he should fight these authorities and the wealthy elite for the freedom of the common people. I'll revisit this in a little bit, but crucially, it does mean he thinks he's the good guy and they're the bad guys. And being angry and bitter about the fact that they seem to be winning this fight, that makes as much sense to me as any other explanation you could give of his psychology or his behaviour. And it's one of the reasons I think he's so convincing and persuasive as a leader in regards to his philosophy. Because I don't find there to be that many inconsistencies in the logic of what he's saying.
We ain't got no problems with you, sir. Nor you with us. But if you want to start one, there's gonna be a lot of folks dead in this room before it's done.
Now, at this point in the video, I acknowledge that it might sound like I'm not being nearly as critical of Dutch as I really should be, because so far, pretty much everything I've said about him is positive. In this picture I've painted of Dutch, he seems noble and caring and idealistic. But this whole picture is just what he sees in a reflection. This is what he would tell you about himself if you asked him. And in this reflection, there aren't any flaws. That absolutely does not mean that there aren't any there, but crucially, he can't see them, or is at least unwilling to acknowledge them. In his own mind, losing is inconceivable, and winning, whatever he thinks that means, is his destiny. And given the fact that he's convinced not just himself of all this, but also everyone around him, what do you suppose that does to a person's ego, especially over a career, or I guess maybe a crusade in his mind, lasting more than 2 decades? The whole time constantly inflating his ego further and further, constantly bolstering his ideas, becoming more and more enraged by the state of the world. And how do you think a person like that might react if it starts to look like that career, that crusade of his, all ends up being for nothing? It would break him. Who knows what he would do? And obviously, if you played the game, you know the answer to that question, but examining his behaviour in the later chapters through this perspective makes him seem a lot less random and erratic, and instead highlights the key characteristics that make Dutch who he is at his core, the man behind the magnetic outward persona. Dutch van der Linde is stubborn, and he is angry. Combining these characteristics with the ego he's developed create a cocktail of flaws that complement each other in the worst possible ways. There is no cooling him down, there is no changing his mind. These characteristics are his nature and are as inherent to him as his heart or his lungs. This is who he is, and no set of circumstances, no amount of time, no particular event will ever change that. I mentioned in my last video that one of the most common components of great and compelling characters is their evolution and growth throughout the story they inhabit. And the most common method of writing this character evolution is using circumstances within the narrative to challenge the character's core values, or to force them into actions they otherwise wouldn't undertake. For Arthur, it was his TB diagnosis that was the most pivotal moment in his evolution. But for Dutch, he doesn't get a moment like that. He isn't given a terminal diagnosis or ever arrives at a particular crossroads, and even if he did, as I mentioned, it wouldn't change it. Coming back to Dutch's anarchism, his main adversary isn't someone like Leviticus Cornwall or Angelo Bronte or the Pinkertons. No, Dutch's true enemy is actually just change. And I'm not saying that change is his main adversary because he's an outlaw in a civilized world and that times have changed. I'm not saying that. Everyone in the gang is an outlaw, so being one sort of isn't the problem. You wouldn't say that Arthur's main enemy is change, so why is it that for Dutch it feels so appropriate? And I think the reason is that for Dutch specifically, change isn't something that he can adapt to. Due to that bullheaded stubbornness I mentioned earlier, he can't evolve into being anything other than what he is now. But this is a different time, and the world just doesn't tolerate outlaws like Dutch anymore. And despite all his intelligence, he just can't seem to recognise what is blindingly obvious. He can't conceive that there's no scenario in which this enemy will permit him a happily ever after. It's just not going to happen. Cornwall, Bronte, the Pinkertons, what these villains really are is just the physical personifications of that progress. They're just the faces of that change that Dutch is fighting against. These people are not unique, one-of-a-kind characters. Dutch could kill any one of them and surely someone else would just immediately take their place. And Dutch having to face one after another, foiling each and every one of his plans, is the clearest writing on the wall that frustratingly he can't read. And so the only question left to ask is, what will Dutch do when he finally realises this? As pressure mounts further and further, the added stress upon Dutch does gradually squeeze out a few of his darker impulses, but in Chapter 4, there is a cascading series of events that changes everything for Dutch, and the first is Bronte's betrayal in the trolley station heist. Up to this point, more than enough has gone wrong for the gang that Dutch really cannot afford any further setbacks, and the margin for error is becoming razor thin. Dutch already reviled Bronte. And look, I can't really blame him. Bronte is a smug, condescending, dishonourable snake who insults and belittles Dutch to his face.
Yes. Go, enjoy yourselves and mingle with this vulgar scum. It'll make you long for the days when you could shoot each other and screw cows out on the open range.
Those sure were the days.
As we've discussed, Dutch has a huge ego, is incredibly persistent and stubborn, is incapable of seeing the flaws in his own reasoning, and has an extremely short fuse. This is not a man you should insult, laugh at, or stab in the back. So when Bronte does this...
There should be stacks of cash in there. He told us there was. Look again.
There's no stacks. A few dollars in coins, that's it.
Damn!
We got a problem. There's a ton of cops out there.
Come on now! We got you surrounded!
That greasy son of a bitch, he set us up!
Dutch now has a pretty understandable reason to want to retaliate. Bronte betraying his trust validates everything he already despised about him, and now the itch for revenge is an extremely difficult sensation to try and ignore. While this event is a turning point, he actually doesn't initially externalize his hatred of Bronte, the only hint to which is his suggestion to take out Bronte prior to robbing the bank in Saint Denis. And the reasoning he states for doing so is mostly sound. Bronte is now clearly a significant threat, and you're trying to reduce the number of things that are likely to go wrong during that bank heist. And so taking Bronte off the board when he's just double-crossed you, as I said, it mostly makes sense. Though what that reasoning doesn't allow for is this.
Oh, we'll find you. Already, the dogs are on the way.
Oh, yeah. Oh, you're right. You are so right. They are good at smelling filth, huh? So filth has got to be disposed of. Your friends the Pickardins gonna come and rescue you, you repulsive little maggot. Call them now. You call them.
Jesus. Part of your philosophy books cover feeding a fella. Good goddamn alligator, Dutch.
Perhaps Dutch was a little angrier at Bronte than he was letting on. This is the second event, and is pretty much the last time he's actually able to pull together a convincing excuse to hide his true intentions. We've caught glimpses of this reactionary anger before, but this incident is particularly eye-opening. I mean, the look on Arthur's face kind of says it all. This is Dutch finally releasing all of his pent-up anger and disdain, not just for Bronte, but Cornwall, the Pinkertons, Colin, the government, society, everyone, literally anyone he feels has ever wronged or hurt him. Now he's got a taste of what it's like to really hurt him back. And revenge is a bit like a mosquito bite. It's like once you start scratching it, it can be really hard to stop. This kind of targeted anger can be overwhelming, and it's such an easy and dangerous thing to get lost in. And that cocktail of flaws I mentioned earlier, that makes him especially vulnerable to this. And I also think that it's here that the seed of paranoia is sown into Dutch's mind, because the anger he feels from Bronte betraying his trust opens the idea in his mind that anybody else could as well. And as I said, we're at a point now where one more wrong move, one more catastrophe, could mean the end of the game. So the stress and pressure is dialed right up to 11 for Dutch. There's one final event that occurs that really secures the end of Dutch as we knew him, and you probably know what it is. Hosea Matthews is Dutch's second in command and main consultant, the angel on his shoulder, and has always been an absolutely integral member of the gang. He's the only person high enough in the hierarchy who can effectively challenge Dutch at a time like this, and there's no other person who'd be able to pull him back from the ledge that he's now standing over.
Come on!
No! God damn it!
There's your deal, Dutch.
Hosea.
Hosea's death affects Dutch more than anyone else in the gang by a country mile, and he never gets a moment to truly lament the loss of his oldest and dearest friend. And all that's left is the rage that loss leaves him feeling. That itch he scratched with Bronte is now an overwhelming, burning desire for revenge. He no longer cares about running away. He no longer cares about what's best for the gang. He just wants payback. This is what sets the cement. This obsessive rage completely interferes with his ability to see things clearly. After this moment, there's no bringing Dutch back from the things he does next.
What are you doing? Jesus. Easy, Dutch. What was that?
Horrible old crone.
But you killed her.
She was gonna betray us, Arthur. Couldn't you tell?
No.
Well, I got some Spanish. She was.
You keep killing folk, Dutch.
I am just trying to make sure that some of us survive, Arthur. Now, shall we proceed?
Now, I don't think it's necessary to go into meticulous detail about each and every one of Dutch's wrongdoings throughout chapters 5 and 6, because we'd be here all day. Everything we've unpacked so far contains all the ingredients that inform his behaviour for the remainder of the story. But there is one last element that makes everything 1,000 times worse. Dutch is in an extremely high-stress, painful, paranoid situation and has an unyielding, insatiable anger towards those who have hurt him. And this massively heightened state of arousal means that Dutch is more vulnerable than ever to being manipulated. Micah, seeing the opportunity, takes advantage. Where previously Hosea would have helped Dutch see reason at a time like this and keep him grounded in reality, Micah is now by his side, instigating the opposite. He stokes all of Dutch's most violent impulses, and Dutch is made infinitely worse with Micah whispering in his ear, becoming further and further detached from reality as well as the values he previously stood for. Micah cultivates that seed of paranoia into an overwhelming anxiety and complete lack of trust for everyone except Micah, convincing him into thinking that anyone even remotely undermining him would also have reason to betray him. So when Molly, his own lover, drunkenly announces that she's ratted to the Pinkertons, it only affirms Dutch's already enormous suspicion of those he can trust. And now that Molly is out of the picture, Micah replants the seed by suggesting that there could be another rat and positioning himself as the last person Dutch would suspect. This suspicion, combined with increasingly reckless and violent behaviour, drives a massive wedge between Arthur and Dutch, who historically have been very close with one another.
Be well. I had fun with you today. I was gonna say you're like a son to me, but you're more than that.
And it's brutal that we could go from a scene where Dutch says something like that to one in which he does something like this.
I need help!
Unforgivable, but also the direct result of a very carefully executed manipulation. And Dutch becomes so detached from reality that even when Arthur reveals that Molly wasn't the rat and it was in fact Micah who was snitching to the Pinkertons, Dutch just can't wrap his head around what he's hearing. Micah has successfully nestled into the only trusting corner in Dutch's mind, and so Dutch sides with Micah. Now, all that being said, I'm not trying to take away from the responsibility of Dutch's own actions. He's always advocated for operating as discreetly as possible as to avoid attracting too much attention. So, assassinating Cornwall in broad daylight, using dynamite to destroy a bridge and then robbing the train the government sends to repair it, and manipulating and leading the Native Americans into instigating open warfare against the fucking army. Yeah, none of that is what I would consider lying low. And saying it's all to create noise for the gang to escape amongst the chaos, that's a bullshit idea that the old Dutch would have never agreed to do, and is just a transparent excuse to hurt the people he wants to hurt. And then what about loyalty and never leaving a man behind? He demands that of the gang and has been a tenet he himself has sworn by for his entire life. Well, he does it 4 separate times in chapter 6. Now, while it's obvious to me that Micah is riling him up and he is being manipulated, Micah is only playing on tendencies and characteristics that already exist within Dutch. And the choice to abandon his own principles, contradict his own message, and turn his back on his own family, all of that is on Dutch and nobody else.
It is over. Now, Arthur. It's over.
Oh, Dutch. He's a rat. You know it, and I know it.
He's sick. He's dying. He's talking crazy.
There! Up there on the ridge! I gave you all I had. I did.
Come on. Dutch. Let's go, buddy. We made it. We won. Come on.
John made it. He's the only one. The rest of us... But I tried. In the end, I did.
Come on. Let's go. We can make it.
Dutch sustained defeat after defeat, was betrayed several times by people he trusted, and suffered the deaths of some of his closest friends. His anarchistic philosophy and way of life comes crumbling down around him without the promise of a happy ending, and there's nothing he can do to stop the world from rapidly outgrowing him. Dutch's actions aren't those of an evil, cold-blooded, selfish maniac, but rather they are entirely reactionary and emotional. Dutch is a man who was deeply hurting, deeply angry, and deeply paranoid, and he allowed those feelings to overwhelm and detach him from the values and people he cared about most. And as silly as it might sound, that's why I feel terribly for Dutch. Because he's not a mustache-twirling villain with horrible intentions. He feels more like a casualty of his own nature and flaws, and tragic inability to change them. His flaws feel like something he would change if he only could.
When Arthur is on the cliff with Micah and I step on his hand, there was a raked stage, I guess you could call it, that I had to walk up and away. So he didn't quite die in front of me, he's still wheezing and coughing. And Dutch, in the moment, is realizing his failure. And I turned my back on both of them, and I walked up this rake, and I stood there as the scene continued to play out without me, and I just cried my eyes out.
That's exactly how I feel about Dutch. I mean, how heartbreaking is it that he actually is capable of recognizing his own failure, but at this point it's way too late. And now he's standing over his own dying son who says,
I gave you all I had.
And Dutch is finally brought back to reality. You can visibly see the regret and sorrow for what he's done, realizing he's failed Arthur, he's failed the gang, and Micah is not the ally he thought he was. And so he walks away. He stops fighting just for a moment, he lets it all go. And it makes you consider the possibility that maybe if he had realized this a little sooner, maybe things wouldn't have gone the way they did, maybe Dutch would have had a happier ending. But then again, that wouldn't be in his nature. His decision to track down and kill Micah in the epilogue indicates he still just can't ignore that ever-burning desire for revenge. Maybe part of it was about getting some sort of justice for Arthur, but in his time away, he's clearly reflected and now blames Micah for the downfall of the gang. And after realizing that, he was never going to be able to let that go. And thus, here we go again. By the time we see him again in RDR 1, he's gone right back to his old inclinations of Chapter 6. Which brings us to his last scene.
We can't always fight nature, John. We can't fight change. We can't fight gravity. We can't fight nothing. My whole life, all I ever did was fight.
Then give up, Dutch.
But I can't give up, neither. I can't fight my own nature. That's a paradox, John. You see?
Then I have to shoot you.
When I'm gone, they'll just find another monster. They have to. Because they have to justify their wages.
That's their business.
Our time has passed, John.
Everything I think you need to understand what kind of person he really is, it's all here. It's one of the only times we see him speaking completely candidly. You can't always fight nature, you can't fight change, you can't fight gravity. Gravity may seem a little out of place there, but I think what he's getting at is that gravity is a little bit of a silly thing to try and resist. Like, how do you expect to do that? It's impossible. And trying to fight change, trying to fight nature, is as equally impossible. But I can't give up neither. I can't fight my own nature. That's the paradox. That's such an amazing recognition of his own fault, which is not something I think he would have had the capacity to do in RDR2. He's lived a thrilling life of adventure, freedom, and reverence amongst his peers, and had a sense of significance in the world. And yet all these years later, it still stings so badly to have lost so much and have seemingly nothing to show for it. So from his perspective, what else is there except the anger at those he feels are responsible, and that itch he just can't stop scratching at? And so he doesn't stop fighting, despite knowing that it's pointless, that his situation is unwinnable, and that it won't change anything. And you know, to be honest, his determination, his conviction to never give in, never quit, just to always keep going no matter how bad things look, that's a genuinely endearing characteristic we see in heroes in other stories, but here, it's not endearing at all, it's just frustrating and kind of pathetic and sad. And you can probably tell there's a big part of me that really roots for him, that wishes he had found some peace at some point. I wish he'd found his own path to redemption, but unfortunately, that's just not who he is, and so he has to be the villain. But I say all this entire video, and you know what? Maybe I'm a casualty of Dutch van der Linde. Maybe he's just so convincingly manipulative that I'm being too sympathetic, that I'm buying more of his bullshit than I really should be. And if you think that's the case, or you disagree with anything I've said in this video, I really invite you to explain why in the comments, because all of these videos make it clear to me that people really have a lot to say about this character. But even considering that, I still think Dutch being characterized as an irredeemable monster that only cares about himself, I just don't think that's fair. I think that's a misunderstanding of Dutch van der Linde. I'm willing to bet you probably know people or have at least met people with massive egos who walk around like their shit doesn't stink, or people who are angry or bitter or short-tempered. Maybe you have a vindictive ex-partner, maybe you've been one of these people and it was just a particularly hard time in your life. But these are all just normal human characteristics that many of us have and struggle with, and sometimes we don't even really realize we have them, but they don't inherently make you a monster or define your identity. What they make you is just human. And that is the way in which I think we should talk about Dutch van der Linde. Not as a monster, but as a man. Not necessarily a good one, but not a completely rotten one either. I don't think he is or goes crazy or has sensational mental disorders like that he's a psychopath or a narcissist. The things that are wrong with Dutch are significantly more mundane than that. They are just normal human flaws that he simply can't help or change. And I'm not saying we should excuse or sympathise with the things that he does, but I think we can empathise with why he does them. And that's why I think Dutch van der Linde, just a little bit, is a misunderstood character.